Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we take these dense, sometimes really mind-bending theories and try to break them down into something you can actually hold on to.
Hopefully.
Hopefully. And today we are plunging into maybe the most radical claim modern neuroscience has put forward.
It's a big one.
It is. The idea that everything you experience, the chair you're on, the room you're in, even the sound of my voice, is not direct reality. It's a glorious, customized, self-generated illusion, a deep dive into the brain as a prediction machine.
That's a bold way to start, and it really does frame our source material perfectly. We're looking at the work of neuroscientist Anil Seth, who champions this idea of a controlled hallucination.
Right.
And he builds it on this really sophisticated computational foundation from Carl Friston, his formidable mathematical framework, the free energy principle, or FEP.
So that's the mission today, to get past the metaphor, right, and actually understand the computational logic that dictates how your brain is building this reality and your experience of being you inside of it. Okay, let's just dive right into that core thesis.
Yeah.
Because it's a conceptual shockwave. We're not talking about, simple optical illusions.
No, not at all.
We're talking about the basic moment-to-moment experience of the world. The claim is the mind doesn't just passively receive reality. It actively fingertises what projects it.
It projects it. It's like living in a perpetual, incredibly convincing, personalized version of The Truman Show.
Where your brain is the director.
The director, the set designer, the audience. It invents the colors, the sounds, the shapes, even the feeling of your own body.
And that invention, that's what we call consciousness.
That's what we call consciousness. Seth defines it really elegantly, I think. He just says it's any kind of subjective experience whatsoever.
Okay.
But the crucial difference here is that this theory explains why we have it. It's not just some afterthought. It's a necessary computational tool. The brain isn't just responding to inputs. It's constantly generating its best guess causes for those inputs.
A prediction machine.
A prediction machine. And that's how this squishy mass of cells in our skull manages to create a coherent, usable world.
So if the brain is a prediction machine, what's its prime directive? What is the ultimate goal it's trying to optimize every single microsecond?
Well, the goal is survival, simply put. But we can define that survival in a really formal way using information theory. The brain's core directive is to avoid surprisal.
Okay, surprisal. You're going to have to unpack that. It sounds like when my credit card bill is higher than I expected.
I mean, that's not a bad analogy, actually, but here it's a very specific technical term. It's quantified as the negative natural logarithm of the probability of an observed outcome.
Okay, you lost me a little with the math there.
Let's make it simpler. It translates perfectly into physics and biology because low probability events are just. They're inherently bad for a self-organizing system like you. If you observe something that has a very low probability of happening, given your existence, it means one of two things. Either your internal model of the world is critically wrong, or, worse, your existence itself is threatened.
I see.
Think about it this way. Your brain expects certain things to be stable. Your lungs fill with air, your heart beats in a certain rhythm.
My core temperature stays around 37 degrees Celsius.
Exactly. Those stable conditions are what define you as a viable organism. Survival is fundamentally dependent on staying within this very narrow subset of stable states. We call it the phenotype.
So for me, as a human, sensing a core temp of 37 degrees is incredibly high probability.
Yeah.
It's the expected state. It's not surprising.
Right. But if you were to suddenly sense a core temperature of, say, 800 degrees...
That would be maximally surprising.
And totally incompatible with life. Observing high surprisal means the organism is deviating from its viable, stable state. So the ultimate goal is to keep your sensory data within a predicted low surprise range.
And that's the core insight then. Perception isn't about perfectly mirroring the outside world.
Not at all.
It's about a continual process of prediction error minimization. Just reducing the gap between what the brain expects and what the senses report, all in the service of survival. That's a huge paradigm shift.
Changes everything.
So now that we've set the stakes, we have to talk about the mathematical engine behind all of this, the free energy principle itself. I think this is where a lot of people's eyes glaze over, but it's important to understand the computational necessity that forced the brain to invent this FEP hack, so to speak.
Right, and the necessity really comes from the reality of being a living system. As you said, we're dynamic. Cells are dying, proteins are folding, neurons are firing randomly. We're micro-random.
But at the same time, we have to maintain this coherent, tightly bound pattern. We have to be macro stable.
Exactly. And that means we are constantly dealing with noisy, indirect sensory data.
Yeah.
We never, ever experience the environment directly.
We only experience the correlation between the environment and the changes in our sensory organs.
Yes. We are, for all intents and purposes, trapped inside our skull. We're one layer removed from reality.
So we're constantly inferring the actual causes of our sensations.
Yeah.
The dog barking, the coffee cup, the room temperature, from what is essentially blurry, noisy data.
And to do that job optimally, the brain really should be using Bayesian inference,
The gold standard.
the gold standard for updating your beliefs based on new evidence. The brain wants to figure out the true state of the environment. Let's call it the cause, given the sensory data it receives. It wants to know the posterior probability.
Probability.
Postdatal, the probability of the cause, given the sensation.
Mm-hmm.
But the famous Bayes theorem, it has that mathematical demon in the denominator, right?
It certainly does. The denominator is the probability of the sensory evidence itself. To calculate that, you run into what we call the intractability problem.
Okay, what's that? It means that to calculate that one value, you have to sum or integrate over every single possible hypothetical cause that could have generated that specific sensation.
So hang on. If I feel a drop of rain on my arm, my brain would theoretically have to calculate the probability that the sensation was caused by rain.
Or a bird.
Or a leaky pipe, or a ghost, or some random quantum fluctuation.
Or an infinite number of other possibilities, yeah.
All at once, in real time. That seems impossible.
It is impossible. It would have to compute an integral over infinite possibilities. And since a biological brain can't perform infinite computations, it has to find a shortcut. It has to approximate.
And that's the free energy principle, the approximation, the shortcut.
It's the solution to the intractability problem. It's the mathematical proof that the brain can approximate the optimal Bayesian belief while at the same time minimizing that surprisal we talked about.
So how does this approximation work? What are the building blocks that make it possible?
It's built on two core components, two, let's call them density functions, that exist in the brain's architecture.
Okay.
First, you have the generative model. You can think of this as the G-density, PTSES. This is your internal predictive model. It encodes the expected structure of the world, the correlations between things out there and your sensations.
So it knows that a high ambient temperature usually correlates with a high firing rate from my skin's thermoreceptors.
Exactly. It's your stored knowledge, your internal simulation of how the world works.
And the second component.
The second is the recognition density, or R density, TTSA. This is the brain's current working hypothesis. Its best guess right now about the true state of the environment. We use the letter Q for it because it's explicitly an approximation of the ideal answer.
So the brain is just constantly trying to adjust its working hypothesis, this QPS, until it's as close as it can get to the ideal but uncomputable answer.
That is precisely right. And the crucial mathematical result of the FEP is that by minimizing a quantity we call free energy, you are guaranteed to also be minimizing something called the Kullback-Leibler divergence.
Okay, Kullback-Leibler divergence. I need a translation for that one.
Think of it as the distance between your brain's current best guess and the absolute truth. If that distance, the KL divergence, is 0, your guess is perfect.
And since it's always 0 or more, making it smaller means you're getting closer to the right answer.
You got it. So minimizing free energy mathematically guarantees you are getting as close as possible to the optimal Bayesian belief.
And crucially, we learned that free energy is an upper bound on surprisal.
Yes. The definition is $5 GEC LMNPS1S, which is the definition of surprisal. So if you push F down, you are guaranteed to be pushing surprisal down too. You're forcing the system to stay in those low surprise, high probability, viable states.
So in one single move, minimizing free energy, the organism is doing two things. It's getting closer to the truth about the world, and it's promoting its own survival.
They are computationally identical.
Which brings us to the physics connection. You mentioned the analogy to Helmholtz free energy and thermodynamics. Why is that connection so important?
Because it suggests a fundamental unification. Helmholtz free energy describes the energy available in a system to do useful work. By structuring the biological free energy in a similar way, as an expected energy minus an entropy term, it implies that minimizing F is the same as minimizing the computational cost of resisting the tendency towards disorder.
The tendency of everything to fall apart.
Right. So for any system that's trying to maintain its own boundary and resist equilibrium, which is the definition of life, really, it must minimize this value. This elevates the FEP from just a neuroscience hypothesis to a principle that could govern all self-organizing systems.
So the process of staying alive and the process of perceiving the world are, at a deep computational level, the exact same thing.
The exact same thing.
Okay, so if minimizing free energy is the overarching law, we now need to look at the day-to-day, or rather the millisecond-to-millisecond implementation. And this brings us to predictive coding and prediction error minimization.
Absolutely. The brain isn't flat. It's hierarchical. High levels of the cortex encode very abstract, long-term regularities. You know, the rules of physics, the general layout of your office.
The big picture stuff.
The big picture stuff. While the lower levels are dealing with the immediate, messy, rapidly changing sensory data. And the system works by generating top-down predictions based on those high-level priors.
So my brain sends a signal down the hierarchy that says, I predict my hand is about to touch something smooth and cool.
Precisely. And when the actual sensory input arrives at the lower levels, the brain compares that prediction with the observation. Any discrepancy, any mismatch is the prediction error.
And that error is the critical currency.
It's the only thing that matters. It's the only signal that gets passed back up the hierarchy. And its job is to drive an update of the higher level predictions to minimize that error in the very next cycle.
It's an iterative, self-correcting loop. And the organism has two fundamental ways to minimize that error, which seems to account for pretty much all behavior and perception.
These two pathways basically define our existence: perceptual inference and active inference.
Let's start with perceptual, the internal path.
Right. Perceptual inference is when the system changes its beliefs to match the sensory input. So if you're walking down a dark alley and your brain predicts a burglar based on, your priors about shadows.
But the sensory input, the light hitting my retina, strongly suggests it's just a coat on a hat stand.
Your brain updates its internal model. The error is minimized by changing the hypothesis from burglar to coat. That's perception.
And active inference is the external path. Instead of changing the model to fit the world, you change the world to fit the model.
Yes. You change the sensory data coming in to match your prediction. If your high-level prior predicts that you will feel warm, but you currently feel cold, you don't just change your belief, you perform an action.
You put on a jacket.
You put on a jacket, or you move closer to a fire. You actively alter the world to fulfill your internal prediction. This unifies perception and action under one single imperative.
Prediction error minimization.
Action is just inference by other means. You're inferring what action will generate the sensation you predicted you would have.
This whole framework implies that our conscious experience is a construction. And sometimes these constructions can diverge pretty radically, which is why Anil Seth uses the term controlled hallucination. What's the best evidence that our perception is truly generated internally, not just received passively?
Well, you don't have to look much further than #the dress.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
That internet phenomenon where half the world saw a dress as blue and black and the other half saw as white and gold. That is just compelling evidence that what we experience is an internal construction.
Because the objective physical properties of the image, the pixels on the screen, were fixed. But the subjective experience was split right down the middle.
And that split happened because the photo itself was ambiguous. It was poorly exposed, so it contained fuzzy information about the ambient lighting. Your brain had to infer the cause of the colors it was seeing.
You had to make a guess.
It had to make a guess. If your brain had a strong prior that the photo was taken indoors under yellowish artificial light, it mentally subtracted that yellow spectrum.
And inferred the dress was blue and black.
But if your brain had a prior for being outdoors under bluish daylight, it made a totally different adjustment, which led to the white and gold perception. The colors themselves are not physical properties like mass. They're part of your brain's complex, inferential technicolor production.
The philosophical implication there is massive. We are all generating our own reality based on our personal history and our expectations.
We absolutely are. And when a group of us generates highly similar hallucinations, we agree to call that shared experience reality.
And when we don't,
if an individual generates a radically divergent hallucination, we might diagnose it as a delusion or psychosis. The line between reality and hallucination is just a matter of consensus on the precision of the prediction.
Okay, so to manage that consensus, to manage whether the brain should trust its old model or trust the new sensory data coming in, it needs a mechanism to decide which signal is important. And that's where precision comes in.
Precision is the systems manager, or maybe it's volume knob. Formally, it's the inverse variance of the prediction error.
Right. In simple terms.
Conceptually, just think of precision as the system's confidence, its trust level in a given piece of information.
So if I'm in a dark, noisy room, the sensory data coming from my eyes and ears is unreliable. It's low precision.
Correct. And if that sensory data is low precision, the brain will place less weight on the prediction error it generates. It relies more heavily on its internal top-down priors to fill in the gaps. It basically says, I can't trust my eyes right now, so I'm going to rely on what I expect to be there.
And the opposite would be true if I'm looking at a bright, high-resolution image in a silent room. The prediction error generated is highly precise.
And that high-precision error signal has a powerful influence. It forces the top-down beliefs to update rapidly. And this process, the optimization of where the brain allocates this precision weighting, that's what we universally call attention.
So when I attend to something,
You are computationally telling your brain, I am confident in the reliability of this prediction error. Update my model based on this new evidence. It's the mechanism that allows for flexibility, for balancing the weight of old beliefs against the shock of new evidence.
so far we've mostly applied this to exteroception perceiving the world outside of us. But the hardest thing for the brain to perceive is itself. So we need to shift to interoception and this claim that the self is just another, maybe more complex controlled hallucination.
It is precisely that. It's a perception built on best guesses, priors, memories, but it's fundamentally built on interoception.
The sense of the body from within.
Yes, the deep, mostly non-conscious signals, your heart rate, your hormonal levels, visceral sensations, immunological states, blood pressure. I mean, the brain's #1 job is to keep the body alive, and that requires constant inference on these internal signals.
This completely inverts how we usually think about emotion and embodiment, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The traditional view is that some external thing happens, it causes a physiological reaction in my body, and then my brain kind of interprets that reaction as an emotion.
Right, the FEP and the work of Seth and Friston, it just flips that script entirely. Experiences of embodied selfhood, of emotion, they arise from top-down interoceptive inference. We don't just feel fear after our heart rate spikes. The subjective experience of fear is the brain's best guess about what caused that whole cluster of interoceptive signals.
And it's making that guess to minimize future internal surprise.
Exactly. We are fearful because we are perceiving the internal dynamics of our own beast machine.
And this process is complex because the brain isn't just reacting to what's happening inside, it has to proactively manage it. And this is that crucial distinction between homeostasis and allostasis.
Homeostasis is the basic stuff. Reactive autonomic regulation. Your brain's model keeps your blood pressure or your core temperature steady right now. It's regulation by staying put.
But life isn't static. To avoid surprising, dangerous states tomorrow, you have to anticipate your needs today.
And that anticipatory control is allostasis.
Okay.
Allostasis is the process of regulating the body's needs over time to avoid those dyshomeostatic conditions before they even arise. So if you're running low on energy, homeostasis manages your current blood sugar. Allostasis is the deep temporal model that says you need to actively seek food, plan a path to the kitchen, and make a sandwich.
So this requires looking into the future. It needs what-if capabilities.
Deep temporal models that predict future consequences of actions, yes.
And it's this necessity for long-term, predictive, anticipatory self-regulation allostasis that actually necessitates the construction of a robust, continuous model of a self.
It is the functional reason for selfhood. To make smart long-term decisions, what we call policy selection, the organism has to be able to predict the consequences of different actions across a temporal horizon. You know, where will my body be in an hour? How will this action affect my internal stability tomorrow? That mechanism is the very substrate of agency and identity.
Which brings us to this amazing idea of the beast-machine inversion. I mean, Descartes famously argued that non-human animals were just automata, beast machines, without subjective experience, while the human mind was separate and divine.
The FEP offers this powerful inversion of that historical idea. It claims that our subjective experience, our consciousness, our emotions, they arise because of, and not in spite of, the fact that we are incredibly complex beast machines.
We are systems that are fundamentally designed for predictive physiological control.
And the self model is an unavoidable consequence of optimizing that control, that allostatic regulation.
So the I that I experience is the highest level, most temporally thick prediction my brain generates about itself, and its only purpose is to ensure its own survival across time.
And we can see how crucial that temporal depth is when we look at pathology. The self model creates the narrative self, that continuous thread of identity. If the ability to maintain that temporal model is damaged, identity suffers.
Like the case of the musicologist described in the sources who had catastrophic memory loss.
Exactly. The loss of those high-level priors, those long-term expectations and memories, it just eroded the continuity of his personal identity. His basic consciousness was intact, but the he that existed over time was gone. It shows the self as a functional regulatory tool.
Let's transition from the functional self to the pathological self. We've established that precision weighting is the core regulatory mechanism, that it balances the top-down priors against the bottom-up sensory evidence. So when this mechanism fails, or is chemically altered, the system enters a state of aberrant inference, which we then see as psychopathology.
And this failure is best understood through the lens of the Bayesian learning rate. The learning rate just defines how quickly your internal model updates in response to new evidence, and it's directly controlled by that precision weighting.
Okay, so give us the extremes. What does a low learning rate look like?
A low learning rate is when the system has exceptionally high precision on its high-level priors, extremely high certainty in its current model. It basically says, my beliefs are right, and any conflicting sensory evidence is probably just noise.
So top-down influence dominates, and the system ignores prediction error.
Right. It leads to rigidity, to an underfitting of the model to the changing realities of the world. You see this in states where beliefs are overly rigid, like certain obsessive or depressive loops.
And a high learning rate.
That's the opposite. The system places very high precision on the prediction error, on the sensory evidence. The brain says the world is chaotic and every new piece of sensory evidence is reliable and demands a model update. Bottom-up influence dominates.
Which leads to a frantic, constantly updating model, an overfitting to noisy, transient details.
And we see that in acute crisis, or, very interestingly, under the influence of psychedelics.
Let's start there with that deliberate disruption. This brings us to the rebus model relaxed beliefs under psychedelics.
The rebus model suggests that psychedelics like psilocybin or LSD primarily work by acting on serotonin 2A receptors, which are thought to reduce the precision on high-level priors.
Okay, they chemically dampen the influence of your established entrenched beliefs.
Exactly. And that forces the system into a state that's equivalent to adopting an extremely high Bayesian learning rate. The system becomes highly plastic, very fluid, very bottom-up driven.
And what are the consequences of just immediately cranking up the weight on sensory input like that?
Well, the subjective experience of tripping is often interpreted as rampant overfitting of sensory data, because the high-level priors, which track regularities over long timescales, lose their grip.
The model tries to fit every single detail of the immediate sensory landscape.
Right, which leads to geometric visuals, synesthesia, profound feelings of novelty, and crucially, it results in a collapse in the temporal thickness of the generative model.
And since we just said the self model is built on that deep temporal planning on allostasis, dissolving the temporal depth causes ego dissolution.
Exactly. When the system loses the ability to project and track the long-term prospective consequences of its actions, its allostatic model, the high-level perception of the self, the I that is distinct from the world and has a past and a future, it just temporarily dissolves.
Which explains the therapeutic potential then. Entrenched pathological beliefs, those rigid priors you see in depression or anxiety, they temporarily lose their grip.
They become amenable to revision. Someone with chronic depression often has a very high precision, high-level prior of, say, low self-efficacy or worthlessness. When psychedelics relax that prior, the system becomes fluid, and it allows the bottom-up perceptual inference, the actual experience of the world, to reset or update that fundamental belief.
Which leads to feelings like oceanic boundlessness.
Yes, a sense of peace that arises from the temporary absence of those chronic prediction errors related to long-term allostatic failure.
Okay, so moving from that pharmacologically induced state to chronic psychopathology. Let's look at schizophrenia and psychosis through this lens.
Psychosis is often linked to failures in distinguishing between self-generated and external causes, or to having aberrantly low precision on high-level priors, which lets novel, improbable thoughts gain way too much explanatory power. But the central failure often seems to involve corollary discharge.
Remind us what that is.
When you perform an action, say moving your hand, your motor centers don't just send a signal to the muscles. They also send an internal copy of that command, a corollary discharge to your sensory processing areas.
It's a prediction.
It's a prediction of the sensory consequence of your own movement. And normally, this allows the brain to attenuate or filter out the predicted sensory signal. It confirms agency. It's the brain saying, I did that, so that sensation is expected.
But if that corollary discharge fails, or the precision on that internal prediction is too low, the self-generated action or even a thought creates unattenuated prediction error.
Which is then misattributed to an external cause. The brain senses an unpredicted event, and since its self-generated prediction failed, it concludes the cause must be something outside the self.
This is hypothesized to cause symptoms like hearing voices.
Yes, where inner speech or thought is perceived as originating from an external source. It's a profound erosion of the self-non-self boundary.
Now let's turn to the unique profile we see in autism spectrum disorder, which seems to be less about a prediction failure and more about how the system just handles the sheer volume of sensory data.
It's hypothesized to be a different kind of precision failure, a failure to attenuate sensory precision. In a typical brain, low-level sensory information gets attenuated as it moves up the hierarchy, which allows the higher levels to focus on the abstract structure and the context.
The gist of it.
Right. In autism, it's thought that this low-level sensory precision remains persistently painfully high.
So the sensory prediction error signals are just constantly shouting at the brain.
Exactly. And this results in a hypervigilant attention to sensory detail at the expense of creating a deep, hierarchical explanation. People can get stuck in the fine details, the texture of a carpet, the hum of a fridge, and they're unable to generalize into the abstract, context-dependent regularities that higher levels encode.
A loss of central coherence. The world is experienced as this continuous, overwhelming stream of unfilterable data. That makes the reliance on routines and rigidity, which you often see in autism, seem like a completely understandable survival strategy.
It's an active inference strategy to minimize surprisal. If the sensory world is constantly overwhelming you with unexpected detail, the only way to minimize that error is to actively control the environment.
To enforce rigid routines and predictable settings.
It ensures the sensory input matches the internal, safe prediction, and it reduces that painful influx of prediction error.
And there's a specific interoceptive finding that ties this directly to the self-model and to anxiety.
There is. Studies have found this peculiar mismatch. Objectively, autistic individuals show reduced interoceptive sensitivity, so they're less accurate at detecting their own heartbeat, for example.
Okay.
But subjectively, they report increased trait interoceptive sensibility. They feel their internal states very intensely and are often anxious about them.
So there's this huge gulf between what they think they should feel, what they expect their body to be doing, and the actual poorly sensed state.
A massive increased interoceptive trait prediction error, or ITPE. And this ITPE is strongly associated with high levels of self-reported anxiety, suggesting a core interoceptive foundation for the disorder.
And finally, we should touch on depersonalization disorder, which presents as this profound detachment from the body and self.
Depersonalization offers another subtle variation. Individuals experience themselves as unreal, detached, like they're viewing their life from outside. One hypothesis is that this comes from a mismatch in precision. The brain might be generating accurate interoceptive predictions, but the attention mechanism, the precision weighting, is tuned so low on the sensory evidence coming from the body that the sense of embodiment just fails.
So the brain doesn't fully trust its own bodily signals.
Right, and that leads to this profound sense of unreality and disconnection, even though the body itself is working perfectly fine.
We have completed a pretty comprehensive journey here. We started with this radical philosophical claim of the controlled hallucination. We moved through the necessary math of the free energy principle, established the mechanics of prediction error minimization, and then grounded the entire system in this embodied, self-regulating beast machine.
And the synthesis is really the power of this framework. The FEP gives us this astonishingly unified computational framework. It connects physics, biology, perception, action, emotion, and selfhood through one common, relentless imperative.
Minimize surprise.
Minimize surprise. Everything the brain does, from stabilizing your blood pressure to deciding what color a dress is a form of Bayesian inference dedicated to keeping you alive.
And the practical implementation, active inference, means we're constantly in this self-perpetuating cycle. We either adjust our internal model, that's perception, or we change the incoming sensory data through action to match what we expect.
And the profound implication for you, for the listener, is realizing that the self, consciousness, emotions, they aren't some mystical emergent properties. They are high-level predictions generated by a deeply embodied system designed for perspective control. You're generating a subjective reality, a hallucination that is rigorously designed to keep you alive and minimize error.
We don't just respond to the world. We actively sculpt either the sensory input or our models of reality to maintain this very specific, low-surprise expectation of existence. The knowledge that our reality is a constant internal best guess is valuable, but the implications for personal freedom, I think, are transformative.
I think so too. If our minds are these complex, deep predictive models, and reality is just the consensus of our agreed-upon hallucinations, then it really begs a final question for you to mull over. How much of your waking life is spent reinforcing old, safe, high-precision expectations just to avoid error? And how often do you truly allocate high precision to new, surprising sensory evidence, permitting it to radically rewrite your underlying model of who you are and what the world is?